Cambridge Insider Podcast time. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Cambridge Insider Podcast. It's fall time, which for those that are not in the US, that's such a US term, the fall. Nobody in the world except for the US uses the term fall. So I do want to explain what it means to our international viewers. It means that it's basically autumn. Is that correct? Co-host Leanna Glass?
Yes, it's autumn. But that sounds so formal here in the US to say it's autumn. Fall is just much more casual and more colloquial saying.
And very obvious.
Yes, the leaves are literally falling off the trees, so we call it fall because we think so deeply here.
Cambridge Insider Podcast, we are always just making things clear for our listeners. Leanna, how are you?
I'm good. It is a beautiful sunny afternoon here in Philadelphia, so I'm good. My students are doing well, and I think our topic today is really prevalent in how it's going to affect our industry, and I'm excited to get into it.
Absolutely. So to make it clear for all of our listeners, today's we kick off a two-part series, two-episode series, I suppose, about education and education reform and some of the policies that are happening in China. It's certainly a topic that has wide-reaching implications and something that we feel requires us to discuss over two episodes. Specifically today, we're going to be focusing on an article. It's a CNBC article. They do put out some great stuff, so we do like discussing some of the CNBC stuff that we do see come across our desks. And then in next week's episode, at least, we'll be diving a little deeper into, the implications of that for Cambridge Network and some of the solutions we are looking at as well. Leanna, I'm going to give it over to you to sort of introduce what this is all about, just because you are way more prepared and way smarter than I am. That's the best way to put it. Let's leave it there. Why don't you introduce that?
Okay, well, sounds good. Today we are going to be talking about a new policy that was released by the central government in China. This came out beginning of August, mid-August, sometime around there, and nobody really knew if it was really going to affect kind of regular day-to-day life, but it turns out that it has. So we're going to kind of go over what the policy states and what its goal is and how it's affecting people right now. So basically, the article talks about how this new policy really affects tutoring and, let's say, extra educational opportunities for students in grades, from kindergarten to ninth graders in China. They're really cracking down on how much tutoring you can do outside of school, how these businesses, these tutoring and educational businesses can operate in these communities. And this has caused a lot of ripple effects. So first of all, it obviously affects the students and families because up until now, there's been such an emphasis on academics, and you have to get high grades, you have to be getting these high marks in order to be successful in China, in order to get a good job. It has a lot to do with your reputation, and how much time you're spending on academics has a lot to do with that. So up until now, there's been a huge emphasis on students going to these extra hours of tutoring and academic opportunities, even after a full day of school.
And just if I can just sort of give a couple of thoughts there. For anybody that hasn't been to China, it's very prevalent, this culture, or let me say it used to be very prevalent, this culture of extra additional tutoring and classes. Many of those focused on the English language, but across the board, extra tutoring for a wide variety of subjects. And as Leanna rightfully said, students typically, the last time that I was there, would go to a full day of school, which would end, 2-3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then do another 3 to 4 hours of tutoring, oftentimes in big tutoring centers as well. So maybe a little different from what we have in the US, where if kids do tutoring outside of the school setting, it would maybe be private one-on-one tutoring at a home. There are these massive tutoring centers that were created where you would have hundreds, if not thousands, of kids from the neighborhood that would go to this center and be tutored extra additionally for a couple of extra hours. This became such a thriving business in China that many of the big listed companies in China for the past couple of years have in fact been tutoring companies, additional education, additional tutoring companies. So I will say, and maybe you can give us a little bit more details as to sort of the thinking behind it, but this is a surprise. This is a shock.
This is a huge surprise, and I think it will help our listeners to hear some numbers from this article. So here are some facts that will kind of give you a better idea of how big this industry really is in China. So one thing the article states is that some parents are spending in China, some parents are spending up to 71% of their disposable monthly income on tutoring opportunities for their kids. 71%. Another fact, so in a 2020 report by Oliver Wyman, it mentions in the article, it estimates that China's after-school tutoring market reached $123 billion in 2019. So, and this is before COVID. COVID only accelerated and enhanced all of these numbers.
I mean, that's an insane amount of money. That's some seriously impressive data that you've just given us. So Leanna,
thanks to the article, we have this data.
The obvious question then is, I think in anybody's mind, is why? If this was such a thriving, for me from the outside, again, you're way more prepared. We've made this very clear, but from the outside, if this is such a thriving industry in a country, why would they shut this down? Why would they look to curb some of this? Is there a reason? Is there something that the article says on that?
Right. So obviously with this policy, millions of people are going to lose their jobs, millions of people working at these tutoring agencies. And basically this makes the tutoring industry non-investable, this policy. So, right, your first thought is like, why would they do something like this if it's going to create such a huge change in a thriving market there? I think there are a couple of thoughts in why the government proposed this policy and put it into place. One of the things is just quality of life for students. They want students to have some of the stress and burden placed on their shoulders relieved by not having to worry so much that if I'm not going to all these extra hours of tutoring, I'm still going to be able to find a job. I'm still going to be able to bring success upon my family. They don't want these extra hours of tutoring to be the only means of finding success in China in their future lives. And overall, that's just going to enhance the quality of life for students. Less stress, less pressure, more time to explore, to create, to dive into other skill sets that they probably are looking over because they're so focused on academics. So that's the other thing here, is that I think there's really a push for more diverse skill sets to be coming out of China in the long term. They want students to have the opportunity to discover other things about themselves that they have a skill set in, that are kind of being washed away by just this focus on academics. And then another thing the article mentions is the burden it places on parents financially, socially, economically, to have to put their students or put their kids into all of this tutoring. It costs a lot of money. And I think they're probably seeing the mental health effects of all of this stress and burden that this tutoring culture puts on Chinese families.
It's so fascinating listening to you explain this, and this is completely out of left field. Is that the expression? Out of left field, out of right field, whatever they say. It's just out of the blue. That's the one I was looking for. Just because it's an entirely different, it's a cultural shift. There was such a big focus for so many years in China on developing these incredibly smart, well-educated students that would become big players in industry and entrepreneurs and creators and CEOs and what have you. To completely shift is a big cultural shift. And For all of our listeners, I do just want to remind you next episode, next week, listen out, because we'll be giving a couple of sort of insights into what this means for our industry as a whole from Cambridge's side and some of the solutions and ideas that we're throwing around. Whether you agree or don't agree, or whether you're somewhere in the middle on something like this, I think it's a big, big part of international education. And that's part of the podcast for sure, is to try and, make that clear and see what that means for the industry as a whole. The second thing that I will say is, and I've heard a lot of rumblings about this, something that you mentioned, Leanna, is getting students to not necessarily just be academically focused, but sort of finding students and pockets of students that would, prefer to do maybe some vocational training and take up some of those jobs. There's certainly, and I think this is a worldwide phenomenon, that there's been a lack of vocational, skills, and the skill set in the vocational training is certainly lacking. So to get students to look for careers in those sort of directions is certainly something that I can get behind and makes a lot of sense. So in that circumstance, it does make a lot of sense. But say what you want about how great this is for mental health and for students to be able to sort of just regain some form of balance. It is fascinating to think that you could make such a big shift, almost overnight, I want to say.
Yeah, especially because I know I mentioned this earlier, but during COVID, this industry was absolutely thriving. The article does mention that the industry had seen up to 43% growth during COVID. So I think it's even more shocking for this policy to come out after the industry was really booming. And I think it says a lot that they're willing to make this type of shift with an economy that really was booming at this point. So for me, I feel like it's kind of a step in the right direction, but we'll get more into that in next week's episode with the implications of this policy and how it will really affect people and also our industry in the US, our international education industry. But the article does go on to talk about how if there's not public tutoring opportunities, that a lot of wealthy parents will just go on to hire private tutors. So they don't really know if it's going to work or if it's going to stick. People are going to find ways around it. There's not everyone's not going to buy into this idea that a more balanced life for my kids is the right move. Some people are, going to take a lot of time to come around to this. And if they have the means, they might find private tutoring options.
Yeah, good point. What we will do is we'll have executive producer Dean absolutely post this article in the show notes. And there's just a lot of literature about this and a lot of articles about this out there at the moment. So feel free to just sort of Google it and have a look. It's fascinating, and it will have, regardless of who it affects and how it affects them, as with any policy, it'll be implemented and there will be ways to get around it. There will be we'll see happen in the long term. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the next couple of months and couple of years. Leanna Glass, any final thoughts specifically about that article, but just in general as we look to end today's episode?
Yeah, I think generally I like the narrative that the Chinese government is trying to put forth from my own personal standpoint, but it's also just refreshing to me to see a government take such a stance in a way that is so unexpected and, in my eyes, prioritizes healthy lifestyle over just money-making industries. So, I feel positive about it. I think it'll take a long time to make sustainable change in the culture and in the country as a whole. But it's a really interesting topic, and I'm excited for episode 2, where we'll really look at how it could affect our own industry.
Spoken as a true SDM, as only an SDM can. If you are interested in getting great service, as only our SDMs at Cambridge can provide, student service, student care, social, emotional care, somebody like Leanna Glass looking after your students, feel free to reach out to Cambridge Network and your representatives here. As a reminder, next week we delve into what does this mean for the industry? What does this mean from Cambridge's side, for our partner schools, for potential students? So feel free to tune in next week as we discuss this in more detail. Until next week, Leanna and all of our listeners, bye-bye, everybody.